Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. And welcome to this webinar hosted by Meat and Livestock Australia. Tomorrow is Earth Day, a commemoration that's been going now for some 50 years to demonstrate support for the environment. And the theme of Earth Day this year is Invest in Our Planet. As one of my MLA colleagues very neatly put it to me recently, every day should be Earth Day at MLA because investing in the planet is pretty much core business for us. We invest in everything from sustainability and climate change initiatives like capturing and storing carbon and reducing emissions, to the very unique role that red meat producers play in fostering healthy, sustainable diets and sustainable food systems. So to talk about industry's role, our guests today are MLA's Managing Director, Jason Strong, who'll focus on the very green outlook of Australia's livestock sector, to be followed by our special guest, Diana Rogers. Diana's a dietitian, an author, a filmmaker. She's Executive Director of the Global Food Justice Alliance and someone who's passionate about the critical role that the red meat and livestock industry plays in ensuring sustainable nutrition for populations, not just in Australia and the US, but around the world. She's visiting Australia at the moment, and we were delighted to be able to take the opportunity to invite her to speak with us. So fittingly, our Earth Day webinar this morning is titled Investing in the Health of Our Planet and Body. As you listen to our speakers, we invite you to put some questions in the chat and we will come to them in our discussion at the end. But now to our first speaker, Jason, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Lucy, and it's certainly great to be here. It's such an important time and topic to be talking about things related to the climate and how we interact with and look after the earth, and there's so much focus in this space. So it's such an important time for us at the moment, and the issue around the earth and the climate and how we interact with the planet is incredibly important, and it's one of, if not the most important and topical issues that we see being raised and talked about in so much of our commentary and discussion across the community. And we see it driving not just political policy, but also interest in elections and the things that are of most concern to consumers. So having a balanced discussion is incredibly important, and there's all sorts of accusations and things thrown around from either side about positions that are being taken. And one of the things we feel incredibly passionate about, but also responsible for, is this balanced discussion about how, as agriculture and livestock production systems, do we interact with the environment, and what are we doing to do that in a better, more sustainable way. And we've got to remember that this is not a problem that's happened, or a challenge that's happened overnight. The human interaction with the earth and the environment, we've been working on as humans for thousands of years. It's going to be difficult to get in front of that. It's going to be difficult to fully understand. It's going to be difficult to find solutions that set us up for the next thousands of years that humans are wanting to interact with and benefit from being on the planet. So incredibly important for us to think about how we manage our livestock systems and how agriculture is such a critical has such a critical role to play. When we think about livestock production in Australia and where meat's produced, we cover about half of the land mass. So for some context, the big numbers, it's about 355 million hectares of land in Australia is covered by livestock production, 28 odd million cattle, 80 odd million sheep, about 4 million goats. So large numbers of livestock across a large area. And most animals are managed in an extensive production system. So they're managed using the rangelands or grasslands in a very natural environment, but mostly that land is not suited for anything else. And comments like, if we shifted from livestock to cropping production, how could we change the mix and the production mix? And it's actually just not practical. The majority of the land where livestock are run is just not suitable for cropping. We only crop about 8% of our agricultural area, 4% of our total land mass in Australia. And it's largely because that's all that's suitable to crop as far as soil types and reliability of rainfall and climate variation. So adding to that, livestock, and particularly ruminants, so cattle, sheep and goats, have got this really unique ability to convert low quality grass and pasture to a really high quality nutritious protein for humans. So we've got this fantastic opportunity where we can take lower value land and pasture, and we can convert that into this highly nutritious, high quality food for humans. When we think about this, highly topical discussion around carbon and methane usage, it's really important to understand the natural engagement between livestock and the environment. And methane emitted from cattle is part of a natural or biogenic carbon cycle. And this isn't about saying they don't produce methane. Ruminants produce methane. And we know methane is one of those really challenging gases, and it has a much bigger impact in the atmosphere than many other gases. But there is also differences in methane production as well. And cattle or ruminants are part of this natural cycle where they're producing biogenic methane, which actually cycles out of the environment in a much shorter period of time than methane produced from other sources. So it's not a case of trying to run a story or an argument that livestock don't have any impact or potential contribution to a challenging engagement with the environment. The most important thing is that we understand what that is and what we do about it at the same time as being profitable and productive. So it's the steps that we take to understand and manage the engagement and the interaction between livestock and the environment, which is so important. And too often we end up with poorly informed arguments at 50 paces, which isn't helpful to anybody. So understanding how livestock engage with the environment, understanding the type of environment that they actually operate in and how incredibly beneficial that can actually be, and then how does that cycle actually work over time. So over about a 10-year period, the methane produced by ruminant, by cattle and sheep and goats, cycles out of the system. It's returned back into the biogenic cycle through a CO2 going back into grass production, and it produces CO2 and water, and other outcomes, or the what gets produced from that biogenic methane cycle, which goes back into the water and into the grasses and the pastures and back into the production system being consumed by livestock. So it's not a case of saying there's nothing to see here. It's very much the opposite. It's this fantastic interaction between livestock, land, grasses, the environment, and the production in a profitable way of a highly nutritious food for us to enjoy. So when we think about this broader methane production, there's also an area for us to be thinking about how we manage it, and that's around productivity and production. So when we think about the methane that's produced as a byproduct of an animal's ability to break down these, particularly the pastures, the high cellulose pastures, which are and foods which aren't useful or easily consumed by other animals, and certainly not by humans. Methane's a byproduct of that process. So it's a bit like so many other things we see where we get a benefit from an action or an activity, but there's a byproduct from it. We have a fantastic experience eating a really high quality, very delicious meal, but we probably need to do some exercise afterwards as well. Cows can convert low quality feed into highly nutritious food for humans, but part of the byproduct from that is methane. So how we actually manage that is incredibly important, and that's one of the focus areas that we look at in our research and development. So how can we understand better how this system works, and how can we manage it over time so we can still be profitable and productive, have a very sustainable operating system and production system and certainly leave the environment in better shape. So the CN30, the Carbon Neutral by 2030 program that MLA was involved in kicking off in 2017 is a very important part of that. So it's putting a goal out there for how do we manage our production system to be profitable and productive, but also reduce the impact, the negative impact that it potentially has on the environment. And it's part of the Red Meat 2030 strategy. So the CN30 goal, so being carbon neutral by 2030, and it sets the target of doubling the value of Australian red meat sales by 2030, but also it includes this target of being carbon neutral at the same time. And it's really important that being proactive about that, and the industry putting that stake in the ground in 2017 really had us in front of the discussion. So as topical as these things are now, as topical as methane, environmental impact, climate concerns, livestock interaction with the environment, as topical as those things are, the livestock industry has been working really hard on this now for nearly 5 years. So we do understand a lot more than what we did at the time. And where we came from in 2017 was a CSIRO report that said, if we have the right policy setting and we have the right investment in research and development, then there's a line of sight to livestock production systems to be carbon neutral, and that's the path that we're on. And by being proactive about it, and by being in front of that discussion and getting started earlier, it allows us to focus on things which are not only allowing us to control and manage that interaction between livestock production systems and the environment, but it also allows us to do it in a way where we can drive those changes through things which also provide us with increased productivity or allow us to manage any potential negative impacts on productivity or costs. So we, in a lot of ways, we actually have control of that process. We are certainly managing the risk as an industry of having that forced on us by others, because we're able to demonstrate progress. So this roadmap's really important, and looking at these 4 key areas where we have industry leadership, so across the industry supply chain and the participants in the industry being committed to how we have a sustainable, profitable, productive livestock system, and the things that we need to do to manage that. We've got programs around looking at greenhouse gas emissions avoidance. So how do we reduce the greenhouse gas emission contribution to the national inventory? How do we capture carbon? So we know we're going to produce some emissions, and one option is how do we reduce them, and of the ones that we're still producing, how do we then capture those? And then how do we have these integrated management systems? So how do we look at ways to implement the solutions, implement the options that work in with the supply chain and our production system, so we're able to manage our interaction impact on the environment as a livestock production system, but also we're able to continue to drive production and profitability at the same time. And we absolutely have to have increases in production and profitability, intergenerational sustainability, and we've got to manage our impact on the environment. And there's no reason why we can't have all of those 3 things, because if we're going to have a better environment, we're going to do things which improve the environment. Someone's got to pay for it, and if we're going to do that in a sustainable way, then we've got to be able to demonstrate the productivity and profitability benefits of doing that. And we've got to have intergenerational sustainability. We've got to have a industry supply chain that people want to participate in for generations to come, because if we don't have all of those 3 things, then the systems becomes very fragile, and it's very much a focus of our industry about how we can do that in the best and most collaborative way. Good news is, some of the good news is that, because there's quite a bit of good news, that there's been significant reductions in the contribution of the red meat sector to the national greenhouse gas emissions inventory already. So it's just under 60%, it's about 59% and a bit of change reduction in the contribution to the inventory since 2005, which is incredibly important context for our industry, because so often livestock becomes a target for criticism or concern about impact with the environment, because people can understand that methane has an impact. They can understand that livestock produce methane. They can understand that that's a gas which is challenging for the environment, and they can add those things together and point at livestock as part of the challenge. But we're only about 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions inventory in Australia. So, and that's halved, more than halved, since 2005. So rather than be pointing the finger at the livestock production system, conversation really should be starting from a point of, as the industry which has actually done more in the heavy lifting and has been setting the pace for others and have halved our contribution to the industry to the inventory since 2005, what can other industries learn from that? What can the other 90% of the contributors to the inventory learn from what our sector has done since 2005 to follow on the same path? And it's important that we get some real context around that discussion, that yes, livestock contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but we've actually done more in managing that. We've done more of the heavy lifting in managing that than anybody else. So we've got this great demonstration of progress that's already been made, and how we then build on that going forward is some of the next challenge for us. There's also been some discussion in recent times about this climate neutral position, and why this is important is that it's a really good step along the way to being carbon neutral. So carbon neutral is no net emissions. So emissions are either reduced or contained or captured from a supply chain. Climate neutrality is saying that we're not contributing to warming, and why that's important is that measures like the Paris commitments, for example, are about limiting or reducing the warming of the Earth. And what climate neutrality is a measure of is that we look at our production system, that's saying that the output, so the contribution to the inventory, the impact on the environment of our production system is no greater than it was previously. And the good thing about the livestock production system is because the biogenic cycle cycles so much of our emissions that come from methane out over a 10 or 11 year period. If we're producing the same or less greenhouse gas emissions now to what we were 10 or 11 years ago, then we're not contributing anything at all to the warming of the Earth. And it's a really important progression along the way where that progress can be measured or can be achieved through a number of ways. So one is you manage the herd and flock size, which that's one very simple way to be climate neutral. So you have the same type of emissions, but you have the same size or less herd and flock. That's not a particularly interesting focus for us, and it's certainly not something that MLA is relying on or using as part of the planning for us. But if we're more efficient, we're more productive, we're producing more kilos for the same amount of inputs, we're getting more productivity out of our herd, we're finding ways to have interventions like feed supplements that reduce the production of methane, that allows us to be productive and profitable, but actually reduce less emissions, then we can demonstrate that we're able to produce less emissions than what we did 10 or 11 years ago. So we meet this climate neutral position, which is incredibly important to be able to demonstrate for our industry. So we're on this path to being carbon neutral, so we don't have any net emissions out of the supply chain, but along the way being able to demonstrate that we're already not contributing anymore. So and that's getting lesser over time. So it's an important measure that we want to be capturing in how we look at the progression that the industry is making over time, and it also demonstrates the positive and proactive actions and activities that have been taken by the industry. So the 2030 goal is not achieved by waving a magic wand, and it's going to be difficult. So making changes to how we interact as a population with the environment is going to be difficult. There's no silver bullet. There's not going to be any one solution. We're still understanding how that interaction works. We're still understanding what the drivers are. We're still understanding what some of the challenges are. But how we progressively build on that is incredibly important. And there's a whole range of things that the industry is working on and MLA is investing in to help inform and support those activities. So things like supplements get a lot of the press, and that's sexy and easy to focus on and look at. But there's so much more than that. Improving genetics in getting increased performance from the same inputs, but also the potential for having animals which, for example, produce less methane. How we actually manage our herd and flocks, how we make them more productive for the inputs that we have, how we actually graze our grasslands and pastures in different ways. And there's some really good evidence being captured around pasture and grazing systems that are driving productivity and profitability, but also reducing impacts on the environment, and particularly around carbon capture, for example, looking at how do we make the rumen more functional and efficient, the use of different pastures like legumes, for example, which increase productivity and help us manage the soil better, and of course feed supplements, which I mentioned before. So there's a whole range of things which are being invested in to provide this suite of solutions which allow us to drive productivity and profitability, but also allow us to manage and reduce our impact on the environment. So we know the industry, we know the community is incredibly interested in climate, and they want action. It seems like it's the single most important and topical thing to the population at the moment. But we also want them to feel good about eating red meat as part of a healthy diet. And we know from our consumer sentiment work that the majority of Australian consumers do have a positive view about red meat, about our red meat production systems, about our red meat producers. But there's also a lot of noise as well about the challenge of the environment and what are the sorts of things that should be done about that. So it's really important that we keep that message in front of our consumers about the ability that they have to feel good about eating red meat, because we're doing more than anybody else, and we've already got demonstrable progress about being profitable and productive, and being able to demonstrate to them those good things that we're doing. And interestingly, the messaging about the amount of meat that people eat, our current consumption of red meat in Australia is actually in line with the dietary guidelines. So we've already got some balance in what's being recommended for people to eat red meat 3 or 4 times a week, and the consumption that they have from an industry point of view. So we are in a very good position with our consumers, and the important piece is that we actually keep and maintain that, and the information that we provide them and the way that we demonstrate the actions and activities that we have in this space around connecting with the environment are incredibly important. So thank you very much for your time and for dialing into the webinar. We're incredibly passionate and committed about how we as an industry help and support each other and the broader industry in our engagement with the environment, but most importantly how we have a profitable and productive and sustainable system that leaves the environment in better shape. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Diana Rogers. Away you go.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Diana Rogers. I'm here actually in Sydney right now visiting. I was speaking at the Wagyu Association conference, and I'm so pleased to be joining you. Next slide. So I'm a dietitian, and I also have a background as a producer. So I have kind of a unique viewpoint on all of this. I spent 18 years living on a working farm raising sheep and goats, but my degree in human nutrition is really the main focus of why I advocate for the inclusion of nutrient-dense real foods which include meat, into our diet. And just to take a quick snapshot and looking at malnutrition across the world, we have 1 in 2 preschool-age children are impacted by at least one micronutrient deficiency, and 2 in 3 women of reproductive age impacted by at least one micronutrient deficiency. And these numbers were just recently released, and they're much higher than what we previously understood. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, okay. Zooming out a little bit, we have 9 in 10 women in African and Southeast Asian countries, but it's not only impacting women and children in low and middle income countries, but it's also happening in high income countries. And when you look at women in the US and the UK, can you go back, please? Thank you. We have 1 in 2 women in the US and the UK, 1 in 3 in the US, and then iron deficiency, which is the most common nutrient deficiency worldwide, impacting 1 in 5 women in the UK and the US. And interestingly, of all the main micronutrient deficiencies, these nutrients are best found in animal source foods and specifically in meat. Next slide. When looking at Australia, we see calcium, iron, vitamin B12, and zinc impacting women, children, and men in Australia. And again, these nutrients are best found in animal source foods. And whenever there's a nutrient found in both plants and animals, it's the animal source version of that nutrient that is best absorbed by us. Next slide. This is also an interesting slide if you can make it out from your laptops, but it's basically just showing that per serving, animal source foods are really supplying us with the most nutrient density. So a lot of times you might be looking at data showing the nutrient density per calorie of food, which ends up making foods like lettuce or spinach look really healthy. And I'm not saying they're not healthy, but when you look at a nutrient per calorie, and then think about how many calories is actually in a bowl of lettuce, you would actually need to eat, 10, 12 bowls of lettuce in order to get enough of that nutrient to actually make a difference. But just a small serving of liver, beef, eggs, and cheese, mostly animal source foods, can provide us with a very large percentage of the most common nutrient deficiencies worldwide. The exception would be folate. Folate is found in liver, but liver is less commonly consumed. But we've got, vitamin A, vitamin B12, which is not found at all in animal source food, in plant source foods, calcium, iron, and zinc. All right, next slide. I often hear that people should, commonly swap beans for beef, and that will, be just fine for them. And when you look at beans, you have to be very careful to make sure that it's the same volume, the same size serving. So I went by 4 ounces, which is a typical serving in the US. It's approximately 100 grams. And you can see that for a very small, common serving of sirloin steak, you're reaching a very wide variety of the nutrients that you need. So here we are comparing protein. The same volume serving in beans is not even coming close in terms of protein. You would need to eat so many more calories worth of beans and rice in order to get the same amount of calories that you can get from a very small steak. Next slide. Also, when you look at the protein per serving, you can see that animal source foods like chicken, beef, lamb, and cheese are the best way to be getting your protein per serving compared to plant source foods. Next slide. This is also the calories required to get 30 grams of protein. So I'm just trying to show you this in a multitude of different ways that in order to get 30 grams worth of protein, it's a very small caloric package in fish and chicken and beef and in other animal source foods compared to plant source foods. 400 calories, over 400 calories worth of lentils, which is the lowest calorie unprocessed plant-based protein that you can get. And it's almost 4 times the amount of calories that you would need to eat in order to get 30 grams of protein, which you can get in a very small package of red meat. And protein is the most nutrient dense food. And so as we're looking at high income countries which are suffering from overconsumption, we want to be filling people up, making them feel satiated with the lowest amount of calories as possible. And that's why meat is such an important food for not only combating micronutrient deficiencies, but also helping to make people feel full for small packages and therefore contributing to weight loss. And as a practicing clinician, when I'm working with somebody whose goal is to lose weight, I actually increase their meat consumption, which makes them feel fuller, and they'll naturally eat less of the other foods that are not as healthy for them. Next slide. Beans versus beef when we look at vitamins and minerals. So this is, again, 4-ounce servings, about 100 grams, steak versus kidney beans, but it's also very similar when you look at other types of beans. I just had to pick one for this chart. And you can see that beef beats beans per serving as far as minerals go, especially those minerals and vitamins that are the common micronutrient deficiencies, the things that we need the most of. Guess what? Beef has. So we've got iron, B12, all those other great vitamins and minerals that we are most commonly lacking worldwide. Next slide. As I mentioned before, whenever there's a nutrient found in both plants and in animal source foods, our bodies need the animal source foods. So for example, retinol, our bodies, this is vitamin A, our bodies need the active form, which is retinol. And that is what you get when you eat any animal source protein. You're getting that retinol form right there. Beta carotene is what makes sweet potatoes and carrots orange. That will look on a nutrient package, like on the back of those packages, it will look like vitamin A. It will say vitamin A, but really it's beta carotene. And up to about half of all humans can't make that conversion very easily. And so there are a lot of reasons why some people might do better on a diet that doesn't have as much meat than others. The same thing with iron. We need heme iron. The non-heme iron is not as effective for us. Also in animal source foods, we get the full range of amino acids. We have real B12 instead of B12 analogs, which are in those plant-based supplements. And the same thing is true for essential fatty acids. When we're eating fat from animal source foods, we're getting DHA, we're getting all the right EPAs. That is not the case when we're only consuming plant source foods. And we know that real whole foods, like an egg where you're getting the fat and the protein and all those nutrients in a package, or, same thing with the steak, is much better for our bodies than just taking supplement pills and fortifying, ultra processed foods with these artificial vitamins. And so this is why I'm particularly pushing back against messages that tell children, like Meatless Mondays, that meat is bad. Because if meat is bad for children, what are these kids going to choose? And so when you look at the common foods that kids like to eat the most, and we'll go to the next slide. So I looked up some of the foods in Australia that kids love to eat. I learned about fairy bread. I cannot believe that this is something that really happens here in Australia, but I guess in the US we have similarly interesting foods that kids love. But you'll see there are some meat products here, and my argument as a dietitian is that it's not the mince in the mince pie. It's all the other stuff that we're eating with it. It's not the sausage in the sausage roll. That's actually a pretty healthy thing. It's got some protein, it's got some good fats, but it's everything else in it. And so when people are pushing back against, meat is bad, what they're imagining is not just that burger patty, but the whole entire burger fast food meal that people would be getting. But that burger patty is just chopped up meat with maybe some salt and pepper in it, and it's got iron, B12, all those nutrients that I was talking about before. So it's all these other foods that we associate with, junk food, basically. That's the real problem here. Next slide. Now, the research against meat is largely observational. So therefore, they're looking at, populations that eat a lot of meat, and then they're looking at populations that don't eat meat at all, like vegetarians, and they'll see that, vegetarians in general tend to be healthier people, but there's a lot of lifestyle factors involved in that, and I can talk about that a little bit later. This is the only randomized controlled trial that exists on meat versus less meat in humans, and it was done in Kenyan school children. One group got a meat supplement snack at school, one group got milk, one group got extra calories, and then there was a control group. And they found that the group that got the meat performed the best in all of the categories that they were testing. So test scores, academics, behavior, and physical abilities. And interestingly, the milk group did not do as well. And that's because dairy can impact iron absorption. And so it's not really an efficient substitute for actually eating meat. And I think that's a really important concept, because a lot of schools in Africa are supplementing with milk because it's less expensive than actual meat. But what these kids really need is meat. That's what has the iron, the B12, and the high quality protein. So this is the only study we have. There's never been any evidence showing that pulling meat away from school children will actually benefit them. And that's what's happening right now. We have live experiments happening in the New York City public school system and school systems across the world as they're doing meatless Mondays and vegan Fridays. Next slide. So again, the correlational studies do not equal cause. So this is a really good example of two things that relate to each other, but are not causing each other. And it's, per capita cheese consumption directly correlates with the number of people who die becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Now, that's the same exact logic that people and the media are concluding when they hear that, meat is associated with a higher cause of death from XYZ. It's not the meat that people are eating, it's all of the other lifestyle things. So again, that burger patty in this slide is, or actually the hot dog too, are the healthiest things that people can be eating. It's the soda, it's the alcohol, it's all the other things that are associated with diets. But when people hear meat eating, they immediately assume that it means all of these other ultra processed foods. Next slide. Speaking of ultra processed foods, over 40% of the Australian diet is ultra processed foods. And guess who benefits when we're vilifying animal source foods like meat? It's the ultra processed food companies are really benefiting from that, because it takes the blame away from all of the junk foods that we shouldn't be eating, and instead puts it on a real natural food that humans have been eating for 3.5 million years. So now, a lot of people say, but we're clearly eating too much meat. We need to be eating less meat. And that's the most common thought most people have these days. It's not, eliminating meat altogether, but, people feeling guilty about the amount of meat we're eating. And I think, everyone assumes that Australians are sitting down to a gigantic tomahawk steak every night. But in reality, the average consumption is only 57 grams of meat per person per day in Australia. So that's not too much meat at all. And when you look at, can you just advance the next slide?
So 57 grams of meat is not even 50 grams of protein. And when you look at the average weight of your average guy in Australia at 87 kilograms, you know, there is really good evidence that I've uncovered that anyone over 40 years old should be doubling the recommendation of protein per person per day. So the common recommendation is 8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. If you double that, that's 140 grams of protein per day. That's exactly where I start most men, when they come to me looking to optimize their diet to prevent sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle loss, and to lose body fat. So it's not just weight you want to lose body fat by preserving muscle mass. You can do that by doubling the recommendations of dietary protein, which is 140 grams per person per day. So if you look at, you know, the average red meat consumption, it's actually, you know, a relatively small amount. Next slide. Now, this is just sort of a little bit of a repeat. I do talk a lot about the environmental case for meat as somebody who, you know, was a farmer for many years and has studied sustainable production. But worldwide, only 60% of, not only 60%, 60% of the land mass that we have worldwide is only suitable for grazing animals. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand, that, you know, if you were to remove the grazing animals, you're not going to be able to just necessarily crop that land and, you know, eat the corn or wheat or soy directly from that land, because it's either too rocky, too hilly, or too dry. You know, there's many, many reasons why you can't crop land, but grazing animals can convert food we can't eat, like grasses and other fibers, into the most nutrient dense food for humans. And the Australian context of this, of course, is that Australia has even less arable land than many other places in the world. So it's only 4% of the land in Australia is suitable for crop production. So beef production is something that is really great for the Australian landscape. Next slide. Also, many people will condemn beef for taking up too much water. I know the Meatless Mondays campaign will say, you know, for every burger you eat, that's 10 bathtubs full of water that you're wasting. But what they're not understanding is that most of the water that's attributed to beef is the moisture that's already in the grass or rainwater that's coming down. So what you need to be comparing when you're comparing crops and drinking water is the blue water footprint, which is actually a very small percentage of the water that is used by beef. And in Australia, it's you've got this context here, 68% less water to produce a kilo of beef than it did 30 years ago. So it's actually not this big, huge water hog that people are making it out to be. Next slide. The other thing is, you know, I'm seeing the leather industry really suffering right now, and I'm a huge proponent of utilizing leather. Consumers tend to think that animals are grown, animals like cows are grown specifically for their leather. And that's just such a shame. So I'm seeing, you know, producers burying hides because leather is just not worth any money. You know, companies like Tesla and other EV companies are switching out leather for plastic car seats and saying that this is more eco-friendly, when leather was the most eco-friendly component of that vehicle. So we get a lot of useful things from cattle. Only 42% on average is boneless cuts that humans are consuming. So that's just another thing to consider as we're hearing messages that vilify cattle. We use lots of other aspects of that animal in all sorts of industries. Next slide. The greenhouse gas emissions, I know that Jason touched on this a little bit, but sorry, okay, 5 minutes. Okay. Sorry, now I'm thrown off a little bit. Okay. When you hear those numbers that that cattle use more or emit more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation sector, what you're not what most people are not understanding is that they're looking at the whole life cycle of the cow compared to just the straight emissions from the transportation industry. So if you were to look, and these are global numbers, at just these straight emissions from cattle, it's really only 5% compared to all of transportation, which is 14%. Those larger numbers that they're looking at, the 14.5, which was in Livestock's long shadow, is looking at the feed, the transportation, the processing, everything compared to just the straight emissions from the transportation industry, because we don't have full life cycle analysis of that industry. And in the Australian context, of course, it's just a little bit higher than the global number, but it's still a relatively small number compared to transportation and energy production. Next slide. This is just a repeat again of Jason's slide showing that, you know, the emissions from cattle are part of a biogenic cycle. They're taking existing carbon that's in grass and converting it to methane through their digestive process. But then after 10 years, it becomes water and CO2. The water becomes part of the rain cycle. The CO2 gets used in the photosynthesis process. The oxygen is released, which is what we breathe. And then the carbon becomes the grass, it becomes the roots, and it's fed to the microorganisms below. In the case of fossil fuels, they're taking ancient carbon and methane and pumping it directly into the atmosphere, and there's no cycle, there's no reuptake of that process. And so unfortunately, what most people are suffering from is this idea that I call carbon tunnel vision. So they're looking at cattle as carbon emission generators without understanding that there's so many more aspects to food systems than just carbon emissions. And you know, we have rural economies, we have workers' rights, we have biodiversity issues, soil health issues, human health issues. You know, there needs to be more dietitians talking about the benefits of meat, and less people just claiming that beef emits carbon emissions and it's evil in that way. So we need much more balanced conversations happening about beef production. Next slide. I just did a podcast. It's going to be released next week, and it's really exciting. And it was done in the Serengeti, and it looked at the difference between the pastoral systems, grazing cattle, and just the wild animals on the Serengeti, and found that wildebeests and other wild grazers contribute the same methane that cattle do, and that livestock can actually serve as an effective substitute for wild grazers. And so well-managed livestock are actually serving the same important ecological niche as wild grazing animals. So look for that podcast on the Sustainable Dish YouTube channel, or you can sign up for my newsletter and get a copy of that, because I interview the researcher there. There was a study looking at what would happen if we eliminate all animal source foods from the US food system, and it found that we would only have a reduction of 2.6% in greenhouse gas emissions, but yet we would have an increase in calories. And again, that's because you need to eat more calories to get the same amount of protein if you're not using meat or other animal source foods. We would have an increase in carbohydrates, which again, we don't need when we have rising rates of type 2 diabetes. And we would have an increase in nutrient deficiencies, calcium, vitamin A, B12, and essential fatty acids. Last year, I traveled to 8 different countries and saw the results of this idea of carbon tunnel vision. I see land in Wales and in New Zealand being completely taken out of farm production and being planted in non-native trees to offset the carbon emissions from the airline industry. I see Ireland culling livestock. I see a lot of other huge issues that are just a result of carbon tunnel vision. And I would love to see a study like this happen in Australia. So they did a study looking at the economic value of grazing animals on public land. Next slide. And they found that per beef cow and per kilogram of retail beef, it was estimated that it was over $1,000 in ecosystem services on public land that the cattle were providing, and over $2.70 per kilogram of beef produced. So this is a great study that could happen in Australia as well. Next slide. So livestock producers should be looked at as nutrition and climate heroes. And this is, again, the same thing that Jason was saying. Grazing animals are unique protein upcyclers, consuming food we can't eat and turning it into the most nutritious food for humans on land we can't crop. And I'll stop reading that slide. Meat is sustainable nutrition. Here are just the sort of the top takeaways that from my presentation. Meat is just incredibly nutrient dense, particularly to women and children. There's little evidence that removing meat from the diet will improve health outcomes. Low intake of animal source foods increases the risk of nutrient deficiencies. And farming is an ecosystem service critical, especially to rural communities. Next slide. And so if you'd like to follow my work, you can find me at Global Food Justice on social media and globalfoodjustice.org, where I advocate for the inclusion of animal source foods, and I actually facilitate meat donations to food insecure communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. And great, a lot of content there, great content, some really positive comments coming through on the chat. Yes, we will be sending out this presentation after the webinar. We'll absolutely make it available. I know in a limited amount of time we go through a lot of content, and it's hard to take it all on board. So yes, that will be made available. Time for questions. There are some questions that have come through on the chat. Thank you for those, and please send them through. First question, probably to Jason. Great prezos. Are you able to explain why we're talking about eating red meat on Earth Day?
Thanks, Lucy. We've got to find every possible way we can to spread and share the positive messages about our industry and about the things we're doing, particularly around the environment and the things that are of significant interest and concern for the consumers and the community. One of the things we found when we looked at our community engagement and the consumer sentiment work, it wasn't necessarily that there was negative conversation going on, but quite often we were just absent from the conversation. So there were discussions and opinions being developed and promoted about climate and nutrition and then diet and the environment, and we were actually absent from the conversation. There's a range of things that we're doing as an industry and MLA to get in front of that and to better engage. And why we picked Earth Day is that this is a very popular and well-known activity, but also if you think about the drivers and interest behind something like Earth Day, you can see very easily how they can run off down a path of what could I possibly do to have less of an impact on the environment. Maybe one of the things about my diet, maybe one of the things that I could do is consider eating less meat. So rather than let those types of conversations continue on their own path without engaging in it, we chose this as one of those additional and new for us ways to engage with the community and our consumers and provide some balance to the discussion and give people some comfort about how they can be proactive in reducing their impact on the environment, but still eat highly nutritious red meat, which we know they love and enjoy.
And Jason, more broadly, what do you think industry, not just MLA, but industry needs to do to get these messages out more broadly to the general public? That's another question that's come through.
Yeah, so Lucy, it's a lot of it's volume, right? So one of the things we could do is all be pointing forward. and we just have to do more. All of us have to do more. MLA, industry representatives, but individuals as well. We had 150 odd people registered, maybe 200 in total on the call. You imagine if all of us engaged in with our network immediately after this webinar today, and we've all got a couple of hundred, maybe 500 on average in our network, and then all of them just happen to engage with one or two other people. The thousands of people that then we could touch with a positive view is really quite significant. So we just have to do more of this. We've got to find new and better ways, and this is one of those examples of doing that. But it's not just the webinar today, and it's not just the information. This isn't the outcome or the completion of the activity. This is something that we need to then build off. So hopefully there's people on the call that have seen some information from either myself or Diana that they can pick up, and it helps them in a discussion, or it helps them promote or share something in a positive, proactive way. We just have to do more, and all of us have to do more. And we don't have to educate everybody with every single piece of information and technical fact that we have. And we saw some fantastic examples at the Royal Easter Show just recently, where it's just that positive engagement which can make a material difference for consumers and the community. Here are livestock, and livestock are okay. They're not destroying the planet. Like, that's it. We didn't create the problem, but we're absolutely part of the solution. We don't have to get into a technical biogenic methane discussion with everybody. Sharing those snippets and creating that positive engagement piece are incredibly important. It's all of those old adages: step of 1,000 miles, eat an elephant step at a time, whatever, a bite at a time, whatever it might be. But so if we can all point forward, let's be positive about our industry, positive about our opportunity, proud of the things that we do to be profitable and productive, and to reduce our impact on the environment, and all of us be more willing and prepared to share that information as broadly as we can.
Great. Diana, a few questions coming through for you. MLA, when we talk about nutrition, we often talk about every bite counting and a balanced plate. There's a question here about if protein, or as you've said, protein providing protein from animal sources, more nutritionally valuable food than from plant sources. The hypothesis here is that at least half of our dietary protein should come from animal-sourced foods. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that we need to think about, people's personal preference and how many overall calories they're eating. And so I don't know that, necessarily dictating specific recommendations on percentages or quantities, but allowing people to make the best choices with, their budgets, with what's available to them, what they like, what they prefer to cook, what their family enjoys, is really great. And just giving them that information that they may be benefiting from increasing their protein, whether they're somebody who, is over 40 and wants to prevent muscle loss, or if they're looking for to lose some weight. There's many reasons why increasing their protein and getting it from more bioavailable sources is going to benefit them.
Okay. We're fast running out of time. Quite a few questions for you, Diana. What we will do is respond to these questions, and we'll actually publish them as well with the presentation, and we'll send them around. A great question about how we get this important evidence, the evidence that was presented by Diana and also from Jason. How do we get that to school-age children in Australia to balance the ideology that they hear about eating red meat? There's a lot of discussion going on about that at the moment. I know there's another workshop today in Brisbane dealing with exactly that point, and it would be another webinar for us to explain some of the work that MLA has underway in that space. But be assured that we do a lot of work with schools and getting some of that content into the school curriculum. Never enough, always needing to do more, but an incredibly important area. So conscious of the time and appreciate people taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you to everyone for your questions. As I say, we will respond to those and get those around. I'd like to really thank our speakers, Jason Strong and Diana Rogers, who, as I say, has joined us on a trip to Australia from the US. With that, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. I wish you a great day today and a very happy Earth Day tomorrow. Bye for now.